Uncle Marv here, and welcome back to another episode of my Unhealthy Podcast, where we dive into some uncharted territories of health and fitness. And today we are joined by, I'm going to go ahead and call her an extraordinary guest. Melanie Dorion embodies the perfect blend of medical expertise and personal resilience. You'll understand in just a little bit. She is the founder and medical director at Be Health Vital Center. And
Be Vital.
Be Vital. That's what I said, right?
You said you said it the other way around.
Okay.
We're doing great.
Oh, great start. And she has started a movement called 21st Century Medicine. And we have a great story for you today, folks. Melanie, thank you for the show. Sorry I butchered that introduction.
It's okay. Great opportunity to discuss it further. Thank you for having me.
All right. So let's start at the end, and then we'll go back and start at the beginning, because I think reading your bio the way that I did, people are going to first say, okay, what is 21st century medicine? So let's start by explaining that, and then we'll talk about how we got here.
Of course. Thank you. So 21st century medicine is really an approach and a philosophy to what truly healthcare should be. And it encompasses really 4 dimensions, and everything is rooted in diet and lifestyle. That's the foundation of 21st century medicine. And the other 4 dimensions that you cannot separate to bring any human to healthy, thriving health: mind, body, spirit, and then a social aspect. So really those are dimensions that we take into account in 21st century medicine. Providers who practice 21st century medicine, we always take diet and lifestyle into account. That's the foundation of our approach for whatever the concern. Whether someone comes to us and they're healthy and thriving and they want to maintain that, or they have advanced chronic disease and they want to regain their health and optimal health, we are going to start with diet and lifestyle. And then we're going to look at all 4 dimensions that really bring a human to optimal thriving health. So again, it's mind, body, spirit, social, with a foundation of diet and lifestyle. And that's really how I approach everyone at my medical practice, which is Be Vital Health Center. And then I use the bits and pieces. I've studied many different medical philosophies, including naturopathic medicine, which is a very, very, it's called nature cure in other realms, and very much rooted in also diet and lifestyle, but also in nature. They are medical herbalists. We are medical herbalists, people who practice naturopathic medicine, and we use very natural approaches to healing. And I studied the conventional medicine realm through nursing and becoming a nurse practitioner. And so I've studied functional medicine as well, which is another approach. So I've studied multiple different medical philosophies, and I've come up with really let's have a simplified version of all these different integrative and all these different holistic approaches. And what should we be practicing? 21st century medicine. And 21st century medicine, also, we're early adopters of evidence-based medicine. So what's happening right now in the current state of healthcare is, on average, it's going to take 15 to 20 years to change a recommendation or a guideline. Well, when you think about that, Marv, during those 15 to 20 years, people are not being delivered the most up-to-date information, and some people are frankly just being harmed by recommendations that are outdated. So in 21st century medicine, we use science, updated science.
Now, are you talking about just even like a standard practice? Like if I go to a hospital and I'm sick, the regimen that they use, I mean, I'm sure they have their, checklist of things to go down. Are you saying that those types of things, that checklist, doesn't change in that 15 to 20 years?
Absolutely. There is the absolute potential that a medical recommendation has not been updated in 10, 15, 20 years. Yes.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yes.
Well, okay. So, of course, my first thought now goes to the year of our COVID, when we were dealing with a brand new thing, and they made it sound like they were coming up with all these things on the fly, when, I'll be honest, I heard rumors, I heard conspiracy theories that a lot of the things that we were coming up with had already been in the works, or they were just simply mutations of things we were already working with. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too far. But in a situation like that where we have a pandemic, I have to imagine that they probably made some exceptions for that. Or was it just business as normal?
Oh, absolutely not. And don't get me wrong, some of how we get to medical recommendations is through very thorough due diligence. I have no problem with establishing on current science a recommendation, but it's when there's new science and you don't reevaluate those recommendations for multiple years, and then you don't include most recent research that may contradict. That's where I have an issue with recommendations that have not been updated on the most. And dietary recommendations is one of the best example that I can give about that. Can we talk about the food pyramid?
I was going to just say the food pyramid. That's,
that was a complete disaster that actually directly contributed. It's not a conspiracy theory. The food pyramid directly contributed to push the epidemic of obesity and metabolic diseases that we're in right now in insulin resistance. The food pyramid was not based on any good science, and to change those recommendations took years, and it took a crisis, and it took people getting very, very upset to push for those recommendations to be changed. And the recommendations were very much purchased by big pharma and the big food industry. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's all established in the literature. So this is part of the issue, is that it's so difficult right now to update recommendations, especially when they were established with lots of influences from big food or big pharma. And then recommendations are not the most up to date. Women's health, that's another great one. Right now, the hormone recommendations that are still daily, we're in 2025 right now, still women are being told, I know because I do this daily in my practice, hormone health is foundational to what we do in 21st century medicine. Hormonal recommendations for women are what's being regurgitated is science that is based on bad science from over 20 years ago. So during this time, women are not being given up-to-date science about what is safe, what is not safe, or what should be done to support women, especially during, for example, peri and postmenopausal. Some women are literally being told that they should just suffer in silence and take an antidepressant, which is established to not work for women. Yet that's still a recommendation. So women's health is one of the most medically abandoned field of healthcare, and nutritional science. They're two, from my professional experience, two of the most medically abandoned field in healthcare, because the recommendations are really archaic and are not actually founded on solid science.
Right. Well, that's a lot of what I'm learning here on the Unhealthy Podcast as I speak to people like you who have found another way, because what we've been told in the past wasn't working. And even in stuff that I'm doing, which is not much, I'll be honest. I don't have any chronic illnesses or anything like that. But in just trying to live healthy, looking at all the things that we've been taught over the years, I mean, it's just not right.
It's absolutely.
How we shop for our food, it's just horrible.
Correct. And right now, go ahead.
I was going to say, let me go back real quick before I forget. You had mentioned the 4 dimensions, and you said mind, body, spirit, and social, right?
Yes.
So I've just always talked about mind, body, spirit, which is what I've always heard. Where does social come into that?
Well, social is the foundation of who we are as humans, right? We exist in tribes and villages and in synergy with others. I'm also a Christian, and I'm a firm believer that in the body of Christ, we are not going to be separated from one another. We thrive when we live in community, when we work in community, when we exist. Just for example, as a family to be in synergy, everyone has to use their superpowers, meaning what are they best at? And that's going to vary a lot. And the social aspect, and there's so many great studies, and the Blue Zone study also, which is a massive study of who are the healthiest older adults in the world. We have learned so much from that, and some of the healthiest older adults who have lived the longest without established or advanced chronic diseases, right? They're thriving older adults in the 80s, 90s, and early hundreds. Some of them were people who had meaning in their social life. They were included in social aspects of their daily lives. So the social aspects, this culture, this burnout culture that we are in right now, that you're in a silo, that you should like raise your family by yourself. Like, what a foolish approach. This is pushing women into massive burnout, which is destroying families, which is pushing men to work even harder. Like, this whole thing is completely bonkers. We have lost the villages. So I'm all about 21st century medicine is about bringing back the village, recreating the communities that we are so good at doing, that other cultures are still really, really good at doing. And full disclosure, I'm not American, I'm Canadian, and I'm French Canadian. So it's a subculture. So I'm a foreigner to this country, and I can say with great certainty that the American culture is a very lonely culture. It's a very competitive, hard culture, very siloed, and a culture very oriented towards burnout, to do things by yourself. And that overdoing and FOMO, or fear of missing out, are great things. The more you do, the more you have on your schedule is seen as a great thing. I'm like, where have relationships gone? What was happening with
it's all about how busy you are and how many things you have.
It's how foolish. I treat mostly women in my practice, and I've focused my entire career, which is over a decade, on advanced chronic diseases. So I've seen the sickest of the sick, my entire career. And the number one cause, it's not hormonal imbalances. Of course, diet contributes to that, but that's not what it is. One of the number one causes that is a recurrent theme for women is burnout. They are overworked, undersupported. They have burnt themselves out in every aspect of their lives, thinking that they can raise kids full-time, work full-time, and then exercise and ideally be pretty and look good. Really? That's interesting, because that's not doable. That's not manageable for any human, especially not for women who biologically we are so beautifully designed to have periods of high production and periods of mandatory required rest per our hormone cycle. And that's not being honored at all. Some cultures honor that beautifully, but not in the American culture. You have to just push through, operate like a man 24/7. You're on all the time. And how dare you need rest? For me, that's the burnout culture. And bringing a social aspect, 21st century medicine honors that: mind, body, spirit, and social. And I ask this all the time to people. I'm like, how are you spending time with your relationships? How are your relationships? What are you doing for fun? What feeds your spirit? What feeds your soul? And then I write prescriptions for that all the time. Prescriptions for fun, prescription for social time. Like, I write prescriptions for that because people need reminders and they need an official prescription. Some, not all, but in my population, keep in mind my population, advanced chronic disease, right? A lot, mostly women, 75% are women, and they almost all have burnout as a really foundational trigger and then you start seeing advanced immune issues and digestive issues and mood issues and hormone issues stems from not honoring what your body really needs. And that's what we want to do with the 21st century medicine approach, is with diet and lifestyle. What can we do to really set the stage to honor the beautiful bodies that we are? And the social aspect is huge to that.
Yeah. I'm so ready to start talking about all the things we're doing wrong to fix those. But I want to go back. I want to go back because I did not mention in the beginning, and I did it for a very good, actually it worked out really nice. You've mentioned a couple of times chronic disease. So I should let the listeners know that you are a chronic disease survivor. You've overcome chronic fatigue and you've overcome Lyme disease.
Oh, yes. More than that. Correct. Do you want me to jump into my story?
So now I want to go back and hear how we got started.
Yeah, thank you. How I got so passionate about this is I became very, very sick at one point. And so really the main, in terms of my timeline, what really changed things is in 2000, and I was on the Canadian national team. I was a professional cyclist traveling the world, paid by sponsors and my country to represent my country, Canada, around the world, riding my bike. And I was tied on the last spot for the Canadian Olympic team in 2000 for mountain biking. And I was in the mountains of Spain, practicing for the competition, the Olympic qualifying event. And then I crashed. And in mountain biking, you crash. It's just how it is. But that time I hit my head yet again. And I had what was probably my fifth concussion. And I never recovered. It started a very fast and actually rapid and long decline of my health. I tried to compete 3 days later and it went horribly. It was just one of the worst experiences. I finished the race, but very, very far behind. So needless to say, I didn't qualify. And a little bit over a year later, I was in a Montreal hospital and I was spiking 102 fever. I couldn't breathe. I was extremely ill. And the physician who came in, he was holding my chest x-ray and he asked me, he's like, how many packs per day do you smoke? And I said, excuse me. He said, how many packs per day do you smoke? I said, doc, I don't smoke. I've never smoked. I'm actually a professional athlete. He's like, well, your lungs look like smokers' lungs. They're black everywhere. You have severe pneumonia and you're probably going to have scarring for life in your lungs. He gave me a prescription and he left. That's it. So I knew at that moment that I was extremely sick, that it wasn't just I had pneumonia. I knew my system was really out of balance and I knew something drastic had to change. So March of 2002, I actually decided to retire from professional sports, stop pushing my body, and entered it into a 1 year of just healing and figuring out what was going on and resting and getting some answers. And I packed my 4-door blue Chevy Cavalier and I left my country. I left Canada. I drove south 12 hours and I arrived in the beautiful mountains of Virginia near Charlottesville in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I stayed here in the hopes of getting enough rest and healing and getting some answers for what was going on. So I started seeing all these practitioners from holistic, natural, conventional. I was going to see whoever was going to give me some answers as to why I was so sick. And at this point, so understand, in 2000, I was trying to qualify for the Olympics. And now, March of 2002, I can barely ride my bike. I'm debilitated. I have massive brain fog. I have migrating pain in my body, exercise intolerance. I'm a hot mess.
Well, let me ask this, because that is a very huge swing.
Yeah.
I mean, you go from being, you were the Canadian national champion, right?
At one point I was, yes, sir.
So you're qualifying for the Olympics, you go through this, and I guess what I want to get to is the moment that you decided, I'm going to retire, I'm going to move. I mean, where was your state of mind at that point?
I was broken. I was absolutely broken. So retiring from a career in professional sports or in any field when you're not ready for it, I was super passionate. I loved my career. I love my sport. I still love my sport.
And you were
I love
young
traveling.
too, right?
I was young. Absolutely. I was in my 20s, peak of my professional athletic career. And I was absolutely broken. I left in shame. I was being shamed in the media. Like, oh, I was never that good. Oh, look, she was never that good and she's burnt out. And anyway, it was not pretty how that was handled. And in professional sports, right? When you're injured or something is happening, there's going to be multiple people potentially behind you. They don't really care. So I was on a receiving end of all that, lose all my income very quickly, all my sponsorship, everything. And then, being shamed in the media for, oh, I was never that good, And so I left completely broken, mind, body, spirit. My body was not functioning. I'd become debilitated at that point, and emotionally and spiritually, I did not have the maturity or the capacity or the tools to handle that. So I left. I came to the US. I didn't even use my name, my real name, for a year. I gave myself, I was a nanny for a family in the interim, and they gave me a nickname, and that's what I went by. I didn't even introduce myself. I didn't want anybody to know me. If I was going to go on a bike ride with any other cyclist, they would have very easily identified who I was, and I didn't want to do that. So I went by my nickname, and I was absolutely broken. Yet I knew I had the confidence in my spirit that I knew I was sick. I wasn't actually burnt out. I wasn't crazy. It wasn't all in my head, and I wasn't imagining any of my experience. So I knew that truth inside of me. I just needed someone to believe me and to actually do proper testing, and I couldn't find that in Canada. So I came in part to the US to try and get more answers and to get away, because it's really hard to recover when you're in a constant environment. Right in Canada, I would go to the grocery store and like, oh, Melanie, when are you racing again? We haven't seen you in the media or the journal, in the newspaper. Like, oh, when's your next race? Are you going to try to the Olympics again? Like, I did not feel that I could heal in that environment. So
Gotcha.
I just disappeared, reinvented myself, became a stranger and anonymous, which was actually really helpful, and just rebuilt myself from the ground up. And then entered into this really fearless search of, I'm going to get answers and someone's going to believe me. I'm going to find someone who's going to believe me and they're going to actually figure out what's wrong with me. And after a year of really diligently searching and trying to get answers and doing, of course, some research on my own, I was actually getting sicker despite doing everything they were telling me to do. And I realized at that point, I'm not going to get better. I'm actually getting sicker from especially conventional medicine, and I have to get answers myself. I'm going to have to get my own answers. So I actually put myself through medical school while I was sick so I could actually get some answers. And I did. So while I was sick.
That sounds like another point in time of, so you had just left Canada to come to the US thinking we had answers for you. Obviously we didn't. A year of searching conventional medicine. What was it that said, I've got to go to medical school myself?
When I was getting sicker and I reached the point where I had seen 10 people between conventional medicine and holistic practitioners. I saw anybody who could maybe get me some answers and no one could. I realized, well, okay, I'm going to have to figure out the answers, and I'm getting sicker and I've seen 10 people and I'm really fed up. I'm really fed up, and the system is not helping me, pushing me further into disease. And like the time where a provider like slipped a prescription for an antidepressant, like saying it's in my head. And when I know the truth in my body that I'm sick and I'm not feeling well, this is not in my head. I snapped. I was like, this is BS.
But you had x-rays showing black lungs. I mean, that can't be in your head.
Well, no, but that was recovered, right? Like,
okay, I get you.
Why would 2 years later do I still have breathing issues and fatigue issues and you name it, right? It was a combination of so many things that they weren't testing for, weren't looking for. And it's so much simpler and easier, especially to tell a woman who's now chronically sick, well, it's probably in your head. You got to learn stress management, go see a therapist, and here's an antidepressant. And I slipped that prescription back to them, and I'm like, don't you dare put that in my chart. And I politely declined this because this is not what's happening. I'm actually not depressed. I am actually sick. And I just left. And I'm like, that's it. I snap. I'm like, this is crazy. This system is crazy. It's pushing me further into disease, ignoring all these symptoms, right? But I was in a healthcare provider, so I didn't know how to put these pieces together. So that's when I entered into the journey of doing pre-med and to be on my way to medical school. So that was, 4-year journey to do pre-med. But I went to medical school. I went to naturopathic medical school, which is a very beautiful medical philosophy where you study traditional medicine, but you also study holistic medicine like herbalism, homeopathy, physical medicine. You study a lot of other things in the healing realm. And second year of medical school. I remember this is such a incredible moment for me. I took over like an entire table in the medical library, and I had a librarian. I was asking her to bring me journals and textbooks on certain things based on my symptoms. I was determined. I had my big binder full at this point of testing and all this stuff. I'm like, I'm going to put this together for myself. Second year of med school, you can do a lot as a medical student. So I could read my lab results and I could interpret stuff. And I put at least half of the puzzle together that day. And then I reached out to an author of a medical textbook in endocrinology, so hormones. And I reached out because I was literally textbook symptomatic of this very rare adrenal disorder. And I reached out to the author. I'm like, I'm going to go to the top person in this country. And he emailed me back. He's like, well, I'm in Maryland, so you're in Seattle. That's not going to work. But he's like, I've trained someone, and here's her name, and she practices in Seattle. Well. The Lord works in mysterious ways. She was 6 minutes down the road from me and literally had an opening in like 10 days.
Nice.
So I saw this person. She believed me. I showed up fired up at that first visit, ready to feel dismissed and gaslit again. And she had to say at one point, she's like, you understand I'm on your team, right? And I believe you. And I just started crying. I'm like, no, I don't actually. So I'm going to show up fierce right now. And this is the testing I want. She's like, you're getting all of that plus some. And it was this beautiful healing moment of someone validating my experience and being on my team. And I'm like, that's where healing started for me. That is true healing right there. When you have a provider and you start feeling that they hear you, they believe you, and they're on your team. They're there for you to serve you. That's a beautiful moment. And then I got some answers. I was actually extremely sick. I remember the first consult where we were reviewing lab results. She slid a prescription and she's like, you see the pharmacy across the street right there? I'm like, yeah. She's like, you walk out of here and you go there and get that prescription. You do not spend one more day without this. And I was like, oh. And she explained to me that the adrenal disorder that I was diagnosed with had some life-threatening episodes, that probably some of the episodes I had in my life, I should have been hospitalized, and I wasn't. Oh, but I was told that I was crazy. It was in my head and I should take an antidepressant, right? So what I received in terms of the dysfunction and what I experienced from the conventional insurance-based medicine, it goes pretty deep in terms of my understanding of how beautifully incredible it can be, because I was a professional athlete. I broke bones. I love orthopedics, right? But then how dysfunctional it can be. And when people have chronic complex issues, there's a huge gap. That is, the conventional insurance-based medicine is not serving people with chronic illnesses. We know this. Look at the stats. Every year we have an increase in chronic complex illnesses in this country. So that's what unfortunately I got stuck in that gap. And that's what 21st century medicine does, is we fill that gap where we actually understand science. We use advanced testing. We never forget the foundations of diet and lifestyle. And that's what the approach that was done. And she wasn't enough. I was too complicated just for her. So I had to put a team of 3 providers together.
Okay. I was going to ask, you said that was in your second year and you saw some light. So you still went, through the rest of that year and 2 more years.
Oh, it was a decade of recovery after that.
Okay.
Yeah. It took a decade for me to really, really regain fully my health, because no one was doing this. No one was doing chronic complex illnesses. I was too complicated. Some of the stuff she could handle, but she's like, but I don't do this other stuff. So you have to find someone else. Oh, well, golly. Okay, fine. So I put a team of people. At one point I had 3 practitioners helping me, but it worked. And I learned what a comprehensive approach for chronic disease was through my own very, very hard experience. It was very expensive, very demanding. It was emotionally and mentally exhausting because I had to put all these pieces together. No one was coordinating my care. It was a complete disaster. Right. But at least I was getting help and answers, and I was getting better. I was getting better.
So how much of that happened during your time at Seattle? And then you said an additional, there 10 years total. So how much were you able to put yourselves in that situation there? And then how much of it after?
I healed a great amount while I was in Seattle. I was in Seattle for 6 years because I did medical school there. And then I did my nurse practitioner degree also while I was there. So I was in Seattle for a total of 6 years. And I got most of my health back during that time, which Seattle and the Pacific Northwest is a beautiful area for innovation in medicine. I mean, I had access to all of the coolest biohacking stuff, IV therapy, you name it. You have access to all of that in the Pacific Northwest, right? Medical innovation is booming out there. It's amazing. And then after my school came back to Virginia, to the dark ages, I could not find an IV therapist. I could not find an infrared sauna. I could not find a hyperbaric chamber. I mean, this is now, I came back in 2013. So we're in 2025, but yeah, we've improved a little bit in the Charlottesville area, but Virginia as a whole is, at least 15, 20 years behind what I experienced in the Pacific Northwest for medical innovation. So I was mostly better, but it was really hard to continue healing here without having access to the tools that I knew I needed. So I feel like I was a little bit set back, and I could have probably healed fully, completely a little bit faster if I stayed in the Pacific Northwest. But for life reasons, I came back to Virginia, and then I continue. Well, the healing journey, especially from chronic diseases, is an ongoing, lifelong journey. So there's multiple layers, right? I addressed very hardcore the body piece when I was in Seattle and early on in Virginia, but then I really started diving into the narratives that I had around my body and disease, right? So the mind piece, and then the spiritual piece is I was spiritually bankrupt on and off in my life because, I had lost my way. And just, you have to be pretty diligent at, as a believer to like really be solidly grounded, and, found my way again to a community and to faith. And I'm a foreigner here. So I don't have family in the US. So understanding the importance of the social aspect, I lived it. Losing that was very hard for me. So rebuilding my social network here, and working on all those aspects. Yeah, overall, it took over a decade to get my health back to where I could say, and this is years ago, I've been fully recovered for years. I am thriving. I'm competing again. I'm really having fun. I'm running a business, and I'm engaged in life, and I feel very, very good most days. But I also tell people I live with chronic diseases. So I'm a super healthy, high need person. I have to be very careful about the baselines of how I take care of myself, because I've recovered. And there was chronic Lyme disease. It was, I had many, many toxins that had to be removed out of my body, including mold and heavy metals. And I had multiple autoimmune diseases, including an adrenal autoimmune disease. And celiac disease that went undiagnosed. So I had to be very, very strict for a long period of time for my food. I was severely nutritionally and hormonally deficient. So it took over a decade to correct all of that. But what I see now is, when a practitioner like me doing 21st century medicine, trained in chronic disease management, what took 10 years for me to achieve for my own journey, I can do in 1 to 3 years, because I have a deep understanding of multiple different medical philosophies. I don't forget the foundations of 21st century medicine, and I do a really comprehensive approach. So I see people recover from advanced chronic disease all the time in 1 to 3 years, which is a beautiful thing.
Nice. So let's take another step back, and I want to ask, were you able to find out through all of that some of the root causes, or maybe the origin of when that started for you? I mean, I don't want to think that the crash alone is what did it. So were you able to identify any of those?
Absolutely. I could identify, and diet and lifestyle were key. I mentioned the burnout culture earlier. Well, it's challenging as an athlete because you're pushed all the time, but also I wasn't being guided properly for the actual amount of rest that I needed for me as a woman. Women are not little men. So women in medicine and healthcare women have been treated like little men since the beginning of when prescription started, pretty much, where women need, as a whole, our hormones are made differently from different organs, and we need a lot more rest. So I was in constant state of overtraining and underrested in my professional career, but also the foundations of diet. Because I had celiac disease that went undiagnosed since childhood, I was constantly in a state of inflammation. My digestive tract was totally out of whack, and I was nutritionally deficient. So here I was operating as a professional athlete, nutritionally deficient based on testing. And they were just like, well, that's just your normal. Now I know what I know. I'm like, no, it's absolutely not normal for any human who eats the proper foods to be this nutritionally deficient. And yet I was trying to exist as a professional athlete performing at Olympic levels with nutritional deficiencies and severe hormonal deficiencies. And then because of like some, menstrual irregularities and some PMS and menstrual cramps that were not ideal for any woman, but especially not as an athlete, I was put on oral contraceptive at 15. And oral contraceptives, please, to all the female listeners, is a prescription toxin. Look at the studies. It's high dose of synthetic hormones that are actually really damaging long-term wise, and were never meant to be used like that. So I was put on things that shut down my entire endocrine system. Synthetic hormones don't just, especially oral contraceptives or any birth control. It's a synthetic hormone. It's a toxin. It doesn't work in synergy with your body. So it shut down parts of my hormonal system that, shocker, 10 years of that, actually led to disease. So it's a combination of many things. It's never just one thing. A diet that wasn't optimal for me, and a lifestyle that really did not allow for enough rest for me as a woman, And I was constantly being bombarded by hormonal imbalances because of prescription synthetic hormones. And no one had explained that, or to my parents. And no one still talks about it. Hey, like, and I'm not against prescriptions. Please understand, to all your listeners, I prescribe almost every day in my medical practice, but they're a bridge and they need to be highly respected and understood. And there needs to be education. If someone would have sat down with my mom and I and explained what synthetic hormones actually are and how they work and how this, oral contraception that was going to provide so much relief from all my issues, which didn't really, by the way, and what it was actually going to potentially do long-term wise, never would my mom have agreed to that, or would I have agreed to that? If someone would explain the actual impact on my hormones, hey girl, you're going to lose your superpowers from your hormones because it's going to shut down all of it. Did you know that twice a month you have this beautiful spike in your hormones that allow you to have hormone levels, like testosterone levels that can exceed men's testosterone? And like, that's when you should train the hardest. If someone would explain that simple physiology, which is in physiology textbook, of how my hormones worked and what this prescription oral contraceptives would have done, I never would have said yes, but no one explained that. So those really three things, right? Like being under-rested, overtrained, overworked, and having a pretty significant disease that went ignored and undiagnosed, despite actually childhood testing that should have triggered that. I had an autoimmune disease that progressed, and toxins. My body was constantly fighting and in and out of inflammation. And that fifth concussion, that was how I explain this to people, is we all have a health bucket, and healthy drains, healthy lifestyle, healthy diet, create healthy drains that we can handle stressors. What fills the bucket is going to be unhealthy thoughts, unhealthy spiritual beliefs, unhealthy lifestyle, unhealthy diet, toxins, all of that, disease, medications, that fills up your bucket. Well, my bucket was full. Let me tell you, my bucket was full, and my body was just trying so hard to keep it together. And that concussion, which is a pretty massive incident for anybody, but it made the bucket overflow and be completely dysfunctional and poked holes in the bucket. And like, my bucket needed to be understood. And that's part of why it took so long, because no one was looking at things the way we are in 21st century medicine, of like, let's look at things really holistically, and let's do actually proper testing that is comprehensive, that's going to look at all the different pillars and facets of that are, that's more detail for our next episode, but what really truly leaning into what 21st century medicine looks at as, like, we have the dimensions, but the dimensions need to be supported with pillars of health, of how do you actually approach someone with or without health concerns, right? You're healthy, you want to stay healthy. How do we do that? What do we actually look at in the body? And those are pillars that we use in 21st century medicine that I use all the time at Be Vital, and none of that was being looked at for me. And so, but knowing what I know now, it has to be looked at. So it took over a decade for all that testing to finally be done, for all those pieces to be put together, for my body to come back to balance. And what I experience is the beauty and the resiliency of the human body and the human spirit is when you remove obstacles, the body's going to thrive. And I say this all the time. My job as a healthcare provider, I'm just a facilitator of healing. I remove obstacles and I get out of the way. I let the body do its thing. Our body's wisdom is incredible. It knows what to do and it wants to do it. It's excited to do it. It's excited to detox. It's excited to fight infections. And when it's not, my job in 21st century medicine as a 21st century medicine provider is to remove the obstacles, identify them and remove them. And then I get out of the way. I just let the body do its thing, and it does. The body loves to do what it wants to do.
Yeah. All right. Well, Melanie, thank you very much for sharing your story. And I think this would be a natural place to go ahead and do that break and end off this episode, and then we can come back and explore more about the 21st century medicine. But your story is one that I think most people don't identify with, because most of us aren't professional athletes.
Yeah.
I
feel like I know. And I'll circle back to that, because it is not as relatable when I speak in different, I have multiple different ways of talking about my story, but like when I just present my story start to finish, it's about 8 to 10 minutes, and it has, a different lens to it. And Let's make sure I circle back to that.
Okay, we'll do that.
Yeah. So
and of course, I probably jumped in with some questions that took you off course.
But that's okay. That's where having a part 2 is a beautiful thing, is like, hey, the hardest thing about my journey, so that people can relate to it, because my story is incredibly relatable. I'm a human who lost lots of things in my life, and everybody have lost things. I lost the ability to be as social and to be present, and I had lots of shame and guilt and all the things that are completely relatable regardless of where you are.
All right, well, we will circle back and then we will come through on the other side. So folks, thank you for listening, and stay tuned for part 2 of my interview with Melanie Dorion. And in the meantime, live healthy and be happy.